There is a photograph that changed everything. It was a Sunday in October, just past 4 in the morning, and I was doing what I always do when I can't sleep, scrolling through nothing. A mutual friend had tagged a restaurant downtown, a group dinner, and there, at the far end of the table, with his arm around a woman I had never seen, was Daniel. He was smiling the exact smile I used to believe was only for me. The woman next to him, her name I would learn later was Priya, was laughing at something just off camera. She had the kind of laugh you can almost hear through a photograph, open, unguarded. The laugh of someone who doesn't yet know what is coming for her. I knew exactly what was coming for her. I had lived through every chapter of it. My name is irrelevant. What matters is this. For 4 years, I was Daniel's partner. I moved into his apartment on the east side of the city because he said it made financial sense. I put my name on his lease because he said it showed commitment. I lent him money, and when I say lent, I mean gave, because Daniel had a way of borrowing things he never intended to return. I restructured my savings account so he had access because he said, and I quote, "Couples don't keep secrets from each other." He had a lot of sayings like that, things that sounded like intimacy but functioned like handcuffs. By the time I understood what was happening to me, I had lost $42,000, my credit score, my closest friendships, because he'd spent 2 years quietly poisoning those too, and about 18 months of therapy, trying to explain to a professional why I had stayed. Why did I stay? Because he was never cruel in a way that left marks. He was cruel in a way that left questions. Did that really happen the way I remember it? Am I being too sensitive? Maybe he's right. Maybe I am the problem. That particular brand of cruelty, the kind that lives entirely in the gap between what happened and what you're allowed to say happened, is the hardest to name and the easiest to survive in silence. I survived it, quietly. And then I left. What came after the leaving is its own story. The legal untangling, the financial forensics, the slow, humbling process of learning to trust my own memory again. I won't compress that into a paragraph because it doesn't deserve to be compressed. What I will tell you is that by the time I saw that photograph on that October morning, I was 2 years out. I was stable. I was not looking to revisit any of this. But Priya was laughing that laugh, and I recognized it. I had laughed that exact laugh once, in a photograph someone took at a dinner I don't remember anymore. I had been that unguarded, that certain. I put my phone down. I made coffee. I told myself it was not my business. I told myself she was a grown woman. I told myself that warning someone who didn't ask to be warned was overstepping, was dramatic, was the kind of thing people do when they haven't finished processing their own grief. I told myself all of this for exactly 11 days. And then Priya posted something that made my coffee go cold. She had just co-signed an apartment lease. Her and Daniel. She was moving in. There is a specific kind of fear that lives in the chest, not in the throat, not in the stomach, but right in the center of the chest, where it presses against everything else. That is what I felt in that moment. Not panic, not anger, fear. The quiet, considered fear of someone who has read this story before and knows exactly how chapter 2 ends. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. And then I opened Instagram and typed 4 words into her DMs. I need to tell you something. What happened next, what she said back, what I said back to that, and what we both discovered in the weeks that followed is why you're here. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. If you're new to Fur by Firelight, welcome. If you've been here a while, you already know that the firelight stays on no matter how late it gets. Drop a comment and tell me, if you had seen that photograph, what would you have done? Because I genuinely want to know. Before we go any further, I want you to hold on to one detail. Priya had been with Daniel for 8 months by the time I reached out to her. 8 months. That's almost exactly how long it took him to say those same words to me. Couples don't keep secrets from each other. Right before he asked for access to my savings account. But what neither of us knew yet, what was already sitting inside that lease agreement like a splinter neither of us had thought to look for, is where this story actually begins. I need to take you back. Not to the beginning of Daniel, but to the version of me who met him. Because that context matters. It matters the way foundation matters. You can build anything on top of it, but if it isn't solid, eventually everything above it will crack, and you won't understand why until you look down. I was 37 when we met. I had been divorced once, briefly, in my early 30s. A marriage that was more loneliness than love. Ended mutually, no malice, just two people who had mistaken compatibility for connection. I had a good job in healthcare administration. I owned my car outright. I had a savings account I was quietly proud of, the kind you build in your mid-30s when you finally stop spending money on things that don't last. I was not naive. I want to say that plainly. I was not a woman who hadn't seen the world. I had read the articles. I had friends who'd lived through it. I knew the clinical language: love bombing, isolation, financial abuse. I knew what it looked like in theory. What I did not know, what none of those articles prepared me for, is how slow it is, how incremental, how each individual step in isolation looks like nothing. Daniel and I met at a work conference. He was in the same industry, tangentially. He was charming in the way that some men are charming. Not performatively, not loudly, but with a quiet attentiveness that felt, at the time, like genuine care. He remembered small things: the name of my sister, the city I grew up in, the fact that I took my coffee with oat milk. Remembering small things is a skill. It can come from love. It can also come from strategy. The first year was, by any measure, wonderful. He was generous, he was present. He had this way of making me feel like the most interesting person in whatever room we occupied. My friends liked him. My mother liked him. I liked myself when I was with him, which is a particular kind of intoxication that is very hard to talk yourself out of. The shift, and there always is one, was so gradual I missed it entirely while it was happening. It started with small complaints about my friends. Nothing vicious, just observations. Sarah seemed distracted tonight, didn't she? I don't know. I just don't think Marcus really sees you. Over weeks, those observations accumulated into a kind of sediment. I didn't stop seeing my friends. I just started seeing them through his lens. And his lens was, subtly, consistently, persistently, unflattering. By month 18, I had a smaller world than I'd started with. I hadn't noticed because each reduction had seemed, at the time, like a choice I'd made freely. The money came next. And here is where I have to be careful, because the mechanics of it were not dramatic. There was no moment where he demanded my wallet. It was, and I cannot stress this enough, a series of perfectly reasonable-sounding requests. It doesn't make sense to pay 2 rents when I have this space. So I moved in and stopped paying mine. My credit score took a hit during the divorce. Would you be willing to co-sign just until I rebuild it? So I co-signed. The joint account is just more efficient for shared expenses. Couples do this. This is normal. So I merged. Every single one of those sentences, if you read it in isolation, sounds almost reasonable. What it doesn't show you, what you cannot see until you lay all of them end to end, is the pattern, the architecture of it. The way each step created a dependency that made the next step harder to refuse. I am not stupid. I need you to hear me say that. Because the shame of this, the particular shame of being an educated, self-sufficient woman who was slowly, systematically taken apart by a man with good table manners, is real. And I will not let it sit in this story unexplained. He was methodical, and I was human. Those two facts coexisted. By the time I left, and leaving is its own chapter we will get to, he had access to the account I'd spent 6 years building. The cosign meant my credit was tied to a lease in his name, and the friends I might have leaned on had been, one by one, quietly made to seem like they weren't really on my side. I left anyway, with what I could carry, and I rebuilt. But here is what I never stopped thinking about. I never stopped thinking about the woman who came after me. Because men like Daniel don't stop. That's the part no one says clearly enough. They don't reflect, don't recalibrate, don't enter a period of genuine growth. They find the next woman, who reminds them of who she was before she figured it out. And they begin again. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from a photograph on Instagram, is that by the time I typed those 4 words into Priya's DMs, Daniel wasn't just beginning. He was already 3 moves ahead. And she was already inside the game without knowing she was playing it. Priya responded in 4 minutes. 4 minutes, which told me she was either awake very early or hadn't slept. I would later learn it was the second one. Her message was short. Who is this, and how did you find me? Not hostile, not warm, careful. The message of someone who has been coached, or who has already been warned that someone like me might appear. I told her my name. I told her I had been with Daniel for 4 years. I told her I wasn't reaching out to cause problems, but that there were things she deserved to know before the lease became permanent. I kept it plain. No adjectives, no accusations, just facts stated cleanly, the way you'd hand someone a document you needed them to actually read. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, he told me you might reach out. I read that sentence 3 times, because it is a very specific kind of sentence. It doesn't say he mentioned his ex. It says he told her I might reach out, which means he had anticipated this, which means, and stay with me here, he had already built the architecture of my discrediting before I typed a single word. I asked her what exactly he had said about me. She took a long time to answer. When she did, she was generous with the details. I think she was already uncertain enough to want to see my reaction. According to Daniel, I was the difficult one, the one who couldn't accept the end of the relationship, the one who had fabricated financial claims that were investigated and dismissed. The one who had, in his words, a pattern of targeting people he moved on with. He had told Priya that if I ever made contact, it would be framed as concern, but that it was really about control. I want you to sit with the elegance of that, because it is elegant in the way that truly terrible things sometimes are. He had taken every true thing I might say about him and preloaded it as evidence of my instability. If I said he took my money, that was the fabricated financial claim. If I said he isolated me from my friends, that was my pattern of targeting. He had written a story in which my truth was already the proof of my damage. He didn't just prepare for me to speak. He built a cage out of my words before I said them. I typed back carefully. I asked if she would be willing to look at 3 things before she made any decisions: the co-signed documentation from my name on his old lease, a single bank transfer record, and a screenshot of a text message he sent me 4 months after I left, a message he did not know I had saved. She didn't respond for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours, something else was happening entirely, something neither Priya nor I knew about yet. A friend of mine, a woman I'd reconnected with after leaving Daniel, one of the friendships he hadn't quite managed to fully extinguish, worked in property management. Not for any company Daniel was connected to, just, as it happens, for the building where Priya had just co-signed that lease. She called me that same afternoon. She had seen the lease come through her system. She was not calling to gossip. She was calling because she had noticed something in the paperwork that had made her pause. Priya's name was on the financial guarantee. Full liability. Her credit, her income verification, her deposit. Daniel's name was listed as an occupant, not a leaseholder, not financially responsible. Present on paper in the way that lets you live somewhere, but absent in the way that means if anything goes wrong, the debt does not follow you. He had done this before. My friend knew because she had seen a similar structure 2 years earlier. A lease where the woman carried all the financial exposure and the man walked away clean when it ended. She hadn't known at the time who those people were. Now she did. Priya didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting with my 3 documents, deciding whether to open them or block me. She didn't know that the lease she had signed in good faith had been structured deliberately so that Daniel's name would never appear on a collection notice. She didn't know that the apartment she thought they were building together was, financially, entirely hers to lose. She didn't know that the story he'd told her about me, the unstable ex, the fabricated claims, the pattern of targeting, was not a warning. It was a rehearsal. He had told that story before, probably more than once, and he had told it early enough and carefully enough that by the time I reached out with actual documentation, Priya was already standing inside a version of reality he had built for her. The question was whether she would be willing to look at the walls. Priya opened the documents. I know because she went quiet for 40 minutes, and then her next message was not a message. It was a phone number. Just the digits, no explanation. I stared at my screen for a long moment. Then I called her. She picked up on the first ring, and the first thing she said was not, "I believe you," or "I don't believe you." The first thing she said was, "The text message. The one you said he sent you 4 months after you left. Read it to me out loud." So I did. It was 17 lines. I won't quote it in full because some of it is not mine to share publicly. What I will tell you is that in those 17 lines, Daniel described, in specific, affectionate detail, how much he missed me, how he'd made a mistake, how the new person he was seeing wasn't what he'd hoped for, and he had been thinking about reaching back out. He used my name 4 times. He signed it with a term of endearment I will not repeat. The date on that message was 11 months ago. Priya had been with him for 8 months. The math is not subtle. She was quiet for so long after I finished reading that I checked the line to make sure she was still there. She was. I could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way people breathe when they are working very hard not to react in front of someone they don't fully trust yet. Then she said, "He told me he hadn't spoken to you since you left." There it was. Not a small lie, not an omission. A direct, clean, specific lie. One he had told her early enough that it became part of the foundation of who she believed he was. We talked for 2 hours that first call. I learned things in that conversation that I hadn't expected to learn. Priya was not the woman I had imagined from a photograph. She was a software engineer, methodical, precise. She had, as it turned out, already noticed things she had been talking herself out of. A transferred dinner charge that never got paid back. A weekend where he'd been evasive about his whereabouts. A moment 3 months in where he'd suggested, casually, that she add him to her car's title because it was easier for insurance purposes. She had said no to the car. She told me this with a kind of grim satisfaction. She had said no and he had not pushed. He'd simply nodded and moved on, and she'd filed it away as a moment where she'd been perhaps slightly paranoid. She had not been paranoid. He had not pushed on the car because the lease was already in motion. He didn't need the car. He was working a longer play. I'm going to step outside this story for just a moment, because I need to say something directly. Daniel is not a complicated man. I know that sounds reductive given everything I've just told you, but here is what I mean. Complicated implies internal conflict, implies some wrestling with what he knows is wrong. Daniel has the particular cruelty of someone who has never once been held accountable. Not by a relationship, not by a consequence, not by a single person who looked him in the eye and made the cost real. That kind of unaccountability doesn't create complexity. It creates efficiency. He is very, very good at this because nothing has ever made him stop. That makes him dangerous. It does not make him interesting. I want to know, Team Warren Priya, or did you think it was not my place? Because I went back and forth on this for 11 days, and I still don't know if I made the right call. Drop a comment. I read every single one. Fire emoji if you think I did the right thing. Broken heart emoji if you think I should have stayed out of it. Around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it. And part of understanding it is asking the uncomfortable questions out loud. Back to Priya. By the end of that first call, she wasn't crying. I want to note that. Some people expect tears as proof of belief, and Priya didn't give me tears. She gave me something more useful. She gave me questions. Specific, practical, forensic questions about how I had documented the money transfers, who I had spoken to legally, and whether I had kept records of the cosign paperwork. She was not spiraling. She was building a case. I recognized it immediately because it looked exactly like what I had done, except she was doing it faster, and she hadn't lost 2 years to disbelief first. She told me she needed 24 hours. She had some of her own records she wanted to pull. She would call me back. I said, of course. I said, take whatever time you need. I gave her my number, my email, and the name of the attorney I had used when I was untangling my own situation. We hung up, and I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had read her moving in announcement 11 days earlier. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Relief. The quiet, exhausted relief of finally being believed by someone who was still inside it. But what Priya was about to find in those 24 hours, what was sitting in her own records in plain sight that neither of us had thought to look for, was going to change what this story was about entirely. Priya called back in 19 hours. Not 24, 19. She had not slept. I could hear it immediately. Not distress exactly, but the particular alertness of someone who has been sitting with information that keeps expanding the longer you look at it. She asked me to open my laptop. She wanted to walk me through what she had found, in order, because she needed someone else to confirm that she was reading it correctly. I opened my laptop. The first thing she showed me was a Zelle history she had gone back and manually tabulated. 11 transfers over 7 months, all framed at the time as split expenses: dinner, a weekend trip, his share of a joint gift for a mutual friend. She had never tracked them collectively because individually they were unremarkable. Together, they came to $4,300. No transfer had ever gone the other direction. I said nothing. I let her keep going. The second thing was a credit monitoring alert she'd received 6 weeks earlier and dismissed because she didn't recognize the lender's name and assumed it was a mistake. She'd meant to follow up on it. She hadn't. She pulled it up now. A hard inquiry on her credit report from a consumer lending platform, dated 11 days after they signed the lease. She had not applied for any loan. She had, however, handed Daniel a copy of her financial documents as part of the lease application: income verification, her social security number, her bank statements. Standard paperwork, the kind you don't think twice about when you trust the person sitting next to you at the signing table. The kind that contains everything you need to apply for credit in someone else's name. We don't know, to this day, whether he completed that application, or whether it was an inquiry that went no further. What we know is that he tried, and that he did it quietly, 11 days in, while she was still unpacking boxes. Priya's voice when she told me this was not shaking. It was flat, in the way that voices go flat when a person has processed something so far past their emotional range that the feelings haven't arrived yet. She said, "I need to know what to do right now. Not eventually. Right now." I gave her the attorney's name again. I told her to call first thing in the morning. I told her to change every password that night. Banking, email, credit monitoring, using a device he had never touched. I told her not to confront him yet, not until she had spoken to someone who could tell her what documentation she needed and in what order. She said, "He's going to say I'm doing exactly what you did." I said, "Yes, he is. Let him." What happened next is where Daniel made his first real mistake. Because until this point, he had been careful, methodical, patient in the way that people are patient when they believe they are invisible. But something shifted in the 48 hours after Priya and I spoke. Whether he saw something on her phone, or noticed a change in her behavior, or simply had the instincts of someone who had run this play enough times to sense when it was unraveling, he moved.
He told Priya that he had been contacted by a colleague of mine, that I had been spreading a false narrative about him, and that he was considering legal action. He said this calmly, matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention a minor administrative inconvenience. He said he was telling her because he believed in transparency. Priya said, "That's interesting. She reached out to me directly." He went very still. She told me later that she had never seen him go that still before. Not angry, not defensive, just a momentary absence, as if something behind his eyes had briefly switched off while he recalculated. Then he said she was being manipulated by a woman with a documented history of instability, and that if she had genuinely been in contact with me, he needed her to understand what she was involving herself in. Priya looked at him and said, "Show me the documentation." He didn't have any, because there was none, because the fabricated financial claims he described to her had never been formally investigated because I had settled privately and moved on. He had borrowed the language of legitimacy without any of its substance, and now Priya, methodical, precise software engineer Priya, was asking to see the source file. He told her she was being paranoid. She told him she'd like him to stay at his brother's place for a few days while she thought things through. He left. He didn't fight it, which told her everything. Men who have nothing to hide don't leave quietly when asked. They stay. They explain. They open their phones and show you. Daniel packed a bag in under 10 minutes and walked out the door. And in the silence he left behind, Priya sat down at her kitchen table and called the attorney whose name I had given her. What that attorney found when she started pulling threads the following morning was something neither Priya nor I had known to look for. And it meant this was no longer just our story. The attorney's name was Claire. Priya had called her on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Claire had requested a full credit report, reviewed the lease structure my friend in property management had flagged, and made 2 phone calls that I was not privy to. What she found was this. The lending platform that had run the hard inquiry on Priya's credit had a record of an incomplete application, abandoned mid-process, likely because the income figures Daniel had entered didn't align with the verification step. He had gotten far enough to trigger the inquiry, not far enough to secure the loan. It was the first place he'd stumbled in the execution, and he had stumbled quietly enough that he'd probably assumed it had gone unnoticed. It had not gone unnoticed. Claire filed a dispute with the credit bureau on Priya's behalf. She also filed a formal inquiry with the lending platform, requesting all documentation associated with the incomplete application. Documentation that, once released, would carry Daniel's digital fingerprints in the form of the device ID and IP address used to submit it. That process takes time, weeks, sometimes months. The law does not move at the speed of betrayal, but it moves. And what it leaves behind is a paper record that cannot be explained away with the word paranoid. Daniel, meanwhile, was at his brother's. He had texted Priya twice, once to ask when she wanted to have a real conversation, once to say he was worried about her and hoped she wasn't letting outside influences affect her judgment. She had not responded to either message. On the 14th day, he sent a longer message. It was conciliatory at first, then defensive, then something that read unmistakably like the opening of a negotiation. He said he understood there had been some confusion. He said he wanted to make things right. He said he'd be willing to revisit the lease arrangement if she had concerns about how it was structured. He said he'd be willing to revisit the lease arrangement, not, "I didn't do anything wrong," not, "Your allegations are false," not, "I want to fight for us." Revisit the arrangement. Priya forwarded the message to Claire without responding. Claire noted it. It was added to the file. The lease, ultimately, was broken. The landlord allowed it under the circumstances Claire presented. Not because the law required it, but because the landlord was a woman in her 60s who read the documentation Claire provided and made a human decision. Priya absorbed a financial penalty for early termination. It was not a small amount. She paid it and moved on. And she told me later that writing that check was the least painful thing that had happened to her in 6 months. Daniel was removed from the occupant listing. His name disappeared from the paperwork the same way it had been designed to disappear, cleanly, without consequence. Except for the file Claire was building. Except for the credit bureau dispute with his digital signature on it. Except for a formal complaint filed with the state attorney's office that may or may not lead anywhere, but exists now, permanently, in a system with his name attached to it. I want to be honest with you about what this story is and isn't. Daniel did not go to prison. He did not lose everything. He is, in all likelihood, already somewhere new, already attentive, already remembering small things about someone who doesn't know yet what he is. Priya lost money, time,
and the version of herself that had believed she was building something real. I lost $42,000 and years I will never recover. The system moved slowly and partially, and without the clean satisfaction that these stories sometimes promise. But here is what actually happened. Here is the thing that is small and enormous at the same time. Priya found out in 8 months what took me 4 years. She found out because a woman she had never met decided, after 11 days of arguing herself out of it, that the discomfort of overstepping was worth less than the cost of silence. She did not lose the house. She did not lose her credit beyond what could be repaired. She did not lose 2 years of her life to a man who had already decided she was replaceable. I think about that a lot. I think about the version of events where I stayed quiet, where I told myself it wasn't my business, where I let 11 days become 12, and then 20, and then nothing. I think about Priya laughing that laugh in a photograph, and how close she came to becoming the next person who would someday see his face in someone else's tagged photo, and spend 11 days arguing herself out of typing 4 words. She called me 2 months after everything settled. We are not close friends. We are something stranger and more specific than that. We are 2 women who share an experience we didn't choose, and a decision that one of us made for both of us on a Sunday morning at 4 a.m. She said, "I'm glad you didn't stay quiet." I'm glad too. She didn't win by fighting louder. She won by knowing more. Remember that. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt familiar or close, or like something you've been trying to name for a long time, I want you to know that you're not watching this alone. Subscribe if you're new. Leave a comment. Tell me what you noticed, what you felt, what this unlocked for you. The Firelight is always on, and this community is built for exactly this. The women who already understand, and the ones who are just starting to. I'll see you next time.